Art was on the Board of Trustees of the Council for over 15 years at various times, and he's a graduate of Queens College, City University of New York, and of course his master's and Ph.D. Degrees are from UCLA. Interestingly, his Ph.D. dissertation was on the formation of United States foreign policy in the Middle East during the Truman administration. And this is a subject which he has been interested in on a consistent and persistent basis over 11 administrations since then. He's been a servant of the Jewish community for a long time. He served in major Jewish organizations in Los Angeles, where he also, by the way, taught political science for 4 years, and in Washington State and Houston, Texas, before coming here to Baltimore and serving as the executive director of the Baltimore Jewish Council for 26 years. And all of the time that he was doing that, he remained a serious student of American politics, American foreign policy, international relations, and the Middle East. And combining with that serious academic attention, he was a practitioner. And he has the insight and experience and knowledge that comes from a long time of dealing with and interacting with leaders of Israel, of the Jewish community here, of the American government. So he's extraordinarily well equipped to deal with his particular topic of the evening. As I said, he served this council for over 5 3-year terms. We appreciate that very much. I should probably also note how much the council appreciates the Baltimore Jewish Council. The first organization to financially support the Baltimore Council on Foreign Affairs was the Baltimore Jewish Council. And that was done before the council was founded. And so all of us who are linked to the council are appreciative of that. And most of us, if I'll be forgiven for being politically incorrect, let me note that I think it's fair to observe that no ethnic community in Baltimore is more sophisticated internationally and more seriously attentive to international affairs than the Jewish community. And so we've always been appreciative of that. And to Arthur Abramson in particular, who has been important to us. It's a great deal of pleasure for me to introduce to you. I don't claim I'm responsible for anything he says tonight.
That's good.
Yeah. But in any case, it's a great pleasure to introduce him, the former director of the Baltimore Jewish Council, Dr. Art Abramson.
Thank you, everyone. I have been giving a form of this speech ever since I first began working on my doctoral dissertation, which was in the 1970s. And guess what? Conditions have changed. This election maybe more than any other. There are 3 new factors that have presented me with being able to give a version of this speech that I have never done before. Obviously, of course, beyond the fact that we get new candidates, new administrations all the time. First of all, I was working for most of my career for a 501c3 organization. And as working for a 501c3 organization, I could not be partisan. Well, that tax code-wise. Well, tonight, I am going to be as partisan as you guys let me be. So I'm ready to take all the questions. In fact, I may even enjoy a number of them. And secondly, since 1948 and the creation of Israel, Israel was always a bipartisan issue until the former Speaker of the House, John Boehner, the current Israeli ambassador to the United States, Ron Dermer, I think his first name is Ron, but Dermer, and the current Prime Minister of Israel, Bibi Netanyahu. They decided that they were going to try to do a one-up on President Obama, and thus Dermer invited Bibi to address Congress, and he did. Well, it became a partisan political issue, Israel, and I believe that it is one of the biggest mistakes that have ever been made by an Israeli prime minister, because it has taken an issue that should be seen very much as a non-partisan issue, Israel and the Middle East dispute, and taken it and moved it to very political terms. And third, in every case, when I've looked at this since the founding of Israel and President Truman, every case, candidates, presidents, advisors, they all had relatively similar personal historical backgrounds and foreign policy knowledge of the Middle East, including the religious dimensions of the conflict. Well, I'm at a loss on one of the candidates. Other than rhetoric, I am not sure what the Republican candidate for presidency really believes. And usually you could get behind, and I've talked to members of his team, and I am still troubled by trying to discover where he really is beyond the rhetoric that has come out of the campaign. So keeping the above in mind, I would contend that since Franklin Delano Roosevelt, presidents have been guided not only by a traditional, pragmatic, national security-oriented belief system when formulating policy towards the Middle East, and particularly the Arab-Israel dispute, but towards this area, there is a heavy dose of a religiously catalyzed, very personal, passionate behavior. And I use passion in very much just a very deep concern and involved sense as a very dominant variable in the formulation of policy. Other variables, of course, are domestic politics and bureaucratic politics. But the two key variables are definitely national security, which you would expect every president and their advisors to uphold, and this new element which has been taken to new heights, and that has to do with this religiously tinged passion. So in order to understand presidential actions and to try to predict where a Hillary Clinton or a Donald Trump administration may be on those issues, we need to better understand, through examining the past, what roles pragmatism, and this here again, pragmatism I define very much as a national security-oriented consideration orientation, and passion play in all of these administrations. For the most part, I'm going to go through them quick until we get to the current administration, but if there are any questions, if you'll hold them to the end and the question and answer period, I would appreciate it. Okay, FDR. FDR, and I'm going to label these in respective administration. FDR we see as a very pragmatic administration, and it is very understandable. Everything wasn't seen in terms of national security. He's fighting a war. He has to deal with issues that are incredibly complex, and he does deal with them well. But of course, during all four of those administrations, and of course he only lasted a year or so in the last one, he would during a second and a fourth year, and for obvious their domestic politics comes in, he would pay very close attention to the Jewish community in order to win Congress, and also his own presidency. And he would talk about his support. He never talked about a Jewish state. He talked about a Jewish national home. But every time publicly Roosevelt would express himself on support for a Jewish national home, privately he would have the State Department send a cable to Arab leaders and talk about the fact that nothing would be done without a full consultation with them. In other words, don't worry. This is the so-called full consultation formula. And this becomes very evident, of course, in 1945. He finishes at Yalta. He goes to meet with the King of Saudi Arabia, Ibn Saud. He believed very strongly he can force the king to understand the needs of dealing with Jewish refugees, etc. And he is very much rebuffed. He comes back to Congress and he says, and to the American people, and he makes a statement, well, I've learned more from King Ibn Saud than I've learned in years and years of talking about American foreign policy. But he remained, everything was keyed into ending the war. He would not bomb the concentration camps because he felt, and he told Jewish leaders, that it would delay ending the war. So he's very pragmatic. National security is the key. And of course, remember, that's what you expect of a president. You expect of an administration. National security being the key. What is seen in America's national interest. David Niles, a very important advisor to both he and Harry Truman, believed, though, that if, in fact, he had lived, the question of whether or not there would have been a creation of a Jewish state under a Roosevelt administration is an interesting one. He doubts it, in fact. And, of course, at the end, he becomes very ill. Okay. Harry Truman. We could spend an hour on Harry Truman. Harry Truman was very passionate, very passionate. Now, this is a young man who did not go to college. His boyhood was spent reading books, and he had thick glasses. He didn't participate in sports. And what did he read? What did a person in the Midwest read? The Bible, of course. That's exactly what he read. And of course, in many we came, in terms of the Old Testament, certainly it's the history of the Jewish people. And he read, he understood. He served on an important Senate committee during World War I. He met someone who had a major influence on his role on dealing with the Palestine issue. That was a man by the name of Eddie Jacobson. He helped him get into, Jacobson put pressure on him to meet with Chaim Weizmann, the first president of Israel, at a very crucial time. But of course, Truman is faced with the most massive set of issues. And if Roosevelt didn't do much in terms of briefing him on those issues, think about it. Bringing the war to an end, dealing with all the national security concerns, dealing with Joseph Stalin, and of course, the atomic bomb and whether or not it should be used. Well, I want to tell you about a cabinet meeting. Of vital cabinet meetings, but expresses truly the importance of passion and Truman's role in being the first president to support the creation of a Jewish state. In 1946, February, March of 46, there's a cabinet meeting. And during that meeting, Truman is talking very much about the pressures he's being faced upon the issue of whether to support the creation of a Jewish state to his cabinet. And he makes this statement, and by the way, I get this from Henry Morgenthau, one of his cabinet members' diary, and I quote, and he's referring now, of course, to the Jewish community. If Jesus Christ couldn't satisfy them here on earth, how the hell am I supposed to? Interesting comment from Harry Truman, but not unexpected if you know anything about Harry Truman. If Jesus Christ could satisfy them here on earth, how the hell am I supposed to? Well, the Secretary of the Navy, James Forrestal, no great friend of supporting the creation of a Jewish state, and he's Secretary of the Navy. The Navy has ships. The ships need oil. He says, Mr. President, you are so absolutely right. What we need is oil, and we have to support the Arab world. And Truman turns to Forrestal and says, and again I'm quoting from the diary, "I don't care about the oil. I want to do what's right." And I want you to think about that. I want to do what's right. And the brilliance of some of the politics involved and some of the people close to him show, and they demonstrate very clearly what some of the leaders of the Jewish community who were involved in the administration were doing. They inevitably, and I could talk, like I said, much more about this, they ultimately convinced Truman that the only way he could solve the Jewish refugee problem, and the British screwed the whole thing up, but again, I'm not going to go into details, but the only way that he could solve that problem was through the creation of a Jewish state. And gradually, through some ups and downs, that's what he supported. Now, this was a man, again, I wouldn't describe him the most religious, but he was very much in tune with the whole arguments and the whole history of the Jewish people. He was very passionate about the issue. Okay. In 1952, Eisenhower comes in. Now, the general, and by the way, this is a very pragmatic administration. Eisenhower opened the concentration camps. If you go to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, you notice that they talk about that as you're going up in an elevator. He opened the camps. And for the most part, he was strictly in terms of what he felt was best in terms of security. But he had a very interesting Secretary of State whose name was Dulles, John Foster Dulles. There's a very good book by Townsend Hoops about Dulles called The Devil and John Foster Dulles. And Dulles believed that communism was the work of the devil. He truly believed it. So to the extent that there were issues dealing with Soviet involvement, and of course the Soviet Union was courting Gamal Abdel Nasser, the head of Egypt at the time, to the point that they were courting him, it was seen by Dulles, who then argued at cabinet meetings and otherwise that we cannot allow Russian influence because to do so was allowing the work of the devil. Now, did this have a great extent? Again, a great influence on Eisenhower? I don't know. But he certainly was never seen as a special friend of Israel. I'm not sure he was, you could describe him necessarily as a friend of the Arab world, but he was, and the Arab side in this dispute. But certainly, in terms of national security, he saw communism and the Russians as the work of the devil. Okay, 1960, Kennedy. Pragmatic. Of course, he only lasted 3 years. His ties to the Jewish community were very much through Massachusetts. They were very much tied to the Democratic Party. But he had a big problem, and that was his father. His father was making all sorts of advice, that Joseph Kennedy, ambassador to Great Britain. Joseph Kennedy made all sorts of recommendations to Roosevelt that the United States should side with Hitler against Great Britain, and this certainly created, obviously, problems in the Jewish community. He also had developed a very strong friendship with the leader of Egypt, Gamal Abdel Nasser. But Kennedy was interesting. He discovered that in the southern part of Israel, in a place called Dimona, Israel was doing what? Well, they were building an atomic bomb. Okay? And he decided that he needed to head that off, do what he could to stop it. So he instituted the first arms sale of American missiles, ground-to-air missiles, to Israel. Up until then, despite beliefs to the contrary, the United States had not sold nor given weaponry to Israel. This is the first time. Okay? He's assassinated in 1963. Lyndon Johnson comes in. Now, Lyndon Johnson, of course, is Senate Majority Leader, the domestic politics king. He knows how to make deals, but he quickly gets himself, in part because of his lack of knowledge about foreign policy, he has to lean on a lot of people. And he believes, that in Vietnam he's in a mess, and of course the 6-Day War comes about, and that creates nothing but problems for him on what it's going to do. He advises the Israelis not to strike first. The Israelis strike first. It gets the leader of France, Charles de Gaulle, upset, and of course Israel's weaponry, its most important weaponry, is coming in from the French, so this is going to have an effect. The war ends. Israel says it's waiting for the phone to ring, and the Arab world meets that summer in Khartoum, in the Sudan, and they come out with no negotiations, no recognition, and no recognitions, and no peace as the formula. That summer, and by the way, Lyndon Johnson up until now is very pragmatic. Nobody would ever describe him as especially involved in Middle Eastern issues, much not involved in a religious man, etc. He has a summer barbecue for Levi Eshkol. I think Dayan was there as well, the Israeli defense minister. And during that time, Lyndon liked to drink. He liked to, he liked to have a good time. So Lyndon is, during this barbecue, Lyndon starts talking about Israel. And he says, you Jews, and I'm not going to put the accent on, but another time, another place, we can do that. You Jews, you're like us Texans. We beat the Mexicans and you beat them Arabs. That'll give you that, and that he said. And he goes on and on about this. Well, he begins to identify, as more and more he's beleaguered over Vietnam, he begins to identify with Israel, to the point that he begins the first arms sale of American planes to replace the French Mirage planes. He replaces them with American Phantoms. And he is asked by Johnson to send Moshe Dayan, Israel's defense minister, to Vietnam on a very secret mission and to assess. Well, Dayan, by the way, goes. He comes back and he gives a very simple 2-word answer on what the United States should do. Anybody want to guess? No. Get out. Okay. You got it. It's not funny how we didn't get it then, did we? Anyway, get out. But throughout the basically year and a half or so he had left, Lyndon Johnson was very supportive on very passionate basis in terms of Israel. Because basically the only country that supported him on anything, and Israel was relatively quiet on Vietnam because they needed it. They were smart enough to recognize what they needed to do was Israel. And he becomes a friend, of course, until he's out. Now, Richard Nixon comes in next, extremely pragmatic. Richard Nixon saves Israel at an important time. He's also anti-Semitic. Now, I'm not committing a libel here because the defense against the libel is very simple. What is it? The truth. Well, I have the tapes, okay? And the tapes tell me that Richard Nixon on a regular basis used to call Henry Kissinger, even to his face, a kike, which is not a nice term to Jews. He used to say all sorts of bad things. He told his daughters he didn't want them to go to Florida and visit museums because they were filled with Jews, etc., etc., etc. But he was also a very fierce anti-communist. He hated the Russians, he hated communism, and he was very much a pragmatic look at the world in terms of national security. He really was the ultimate realist, and of course his national security advisor, then Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, although Jewish, was truly he invented the book essentially on pragmatism and national security being the key issue. Well, 1973 happens, the Yom Kippur War. Israel is taken by surprise, even though they had warnings. And at one point, Israel is in severe trouble. in severe trouble. Trouble to the point, interesting things happen. Golda Meir, who's the prime minister of Israel, she makes a decision that, and for some reason it has not gotten much coverage in the history books, she makes a decision that she is going to, in Dimona, or I mentioned it earlier, in Dimona, she is going to have the Israeli Army and Air Force start making it look like, and I don't know if she was serious or not, Israel was starting to put weaponry together to use its atomic bombs. Israel has always claimed it will not be the first to introduce nuclear weapons, and they do that very simply by not putting it all together. Well, they started to put it together, and American spy satellites, planes, recognized that. Well, she then got on the phone with Richard Nixon, not Kissinger, because Kissinger was in fact delaying a resupply to Israel, and she told Nixon what was going on. Israel was in trouble. They drastically needed a resupply of weaponry. Well, guess what happened? Because he also knew about what was happening in Dimona. Nixon got off the phone, used every curse word you could express to Henry Kissinger, because Kissinger had supposedly, and I don't know the truth to this one, kept him in the dark about it, but he was using it to manipulate Israel in terms of peace. And ordered everything the United States had at its disposal, everything that Israel needed to immediately be sent to Israel. So it did two things. One, it kept Israel from perhaps going nuclear. And two, Israel was victorious in the 73 war. Okay, Gerald Ford. Nixon is out in 74. He resigns. Foreign policy is pretty much run by Henry Kissinger, and there is a disengagement agreement reached with Syria, etc. But in foreign policy, it was a Kissinger administration, a very pragmatic continuation of Nixon without the rhetoric, without the harshness, without everything that went with it. Now, Jimmy Carter, an interesting one. Here's this peanut farmer, right? Becoming president, but he's a very religious peanut farmer. So you would think he would be very much on the scale of passion, but he's not. I would describe him as a pragmatic president in terms of his actions, in terms of national security, in terms of religiosity. He had, as I said, no foreign policy experience that anybody could find. He ends up dealing, his big crisis issue is Iran. And he also does something else interesting. Sadat, who is the prime minister of Egypt, who I think will go down in history as one of the great men of the century, a man who risked his life and unfortunately forfeited his life for the sake of peace. He had thrown the Russians out of Egypt, and they were very involved from the Nasser. Well, guess what Carter does? He decides he wants to have a comprehensive peace settlement. He invites them back in. And then guess what Sadat does? He invites himself to go to Jerusalem to change the dynamics. This is how one man can have this incredible effect on policy. Because he changed the dynamics, in my mind certainly, for the better. He goes to Jerusalem. Out of that comes eventually Camp David. Out of that eventually comes a changed world, not necessarily a changed world that reached fruition in what everybody was desiring, but there was a peace treaty with Egypt that has stood to this day. During the Camp David talks, there were numerous times in which both Menachem Begin, who was a religious man, was going to leave, or Sadat was going to leave. Carter was smart. He knew how to deal with people. At one point, he engaged Begin in a Bible contest, which is a big thing in Israel. And another thing he did, he was smart. He learned that one of Begin's grandchildren was having a birthday. He brought him pictures, signed autographs to them. He did everything he could to keep Begin there, and he ended up keeping Sadat there. So he's a very good negotiator. He was very good pragmatic, and though a deeply religious man, he did not see it as did not have the religion, unlike many others who were deeply religious, in terms of the passion to use that as a major determinant of foreign policy. Okay, Bush won. President Bush won. I'm sorry. Oh, I apologize. Yeah, thank you. I skipped over the page, I see, but thank you. Ronald Reagan, how could not possibly. Okay, was Ronald Reagan, let me ask you guys, passionate or pragmatic? No. Ronald Reagan is very passionate, not because he has a great deal of religious basis, but think again, I want you to understand on this dispute, on this issue, this issue that we can't figure out why everybody's been continually fighting, why religion and passion play such a major role. And with Ronald Reagan, it's evident. Ronald Reagan was a very bad actor, a given, okay. But he goes to Hollywood, right? He goes to Hollywood, bad actor, yes, but what does he get involved in? He gets involved in unions, the Screen Actors Guild. He's president of the Screen Actors Guild, right? Now, both Hollywood and unions, he deals tremendous amount with the Jewish community in Los Angeles and Hollywood, etc. He learns of the struggles. This is in the 40s. He learns very much of the struggles of the Jewish community to create a Jewish state. He's also a fierce anti-communist, and he believes very strongly in supporting Israel. It's very much in his DNA out of those experiences as a Hollywood and the unions. During his 8-year administration, he had a battle with Israel over AWACS, the advanced the planes, which he won, Israel lost. The sale of those to Saudi Arabia. And of course, Lebanon in 1982, there was atrocities committed by Israel in the camps, and actually not committed by Israel, but Israel didn't do anything to stop them. They were committed by others. So very pragmatic. Now, the most pragmatic president, I would argue, was Bush Sr. Nobody would ever describe him as a very religious man. His ties actually were to the Eastern establishment. His father was a U.S. Senator. He lived in, obviously, Texas, and got to meet him a couple of times during my stay there. He had as his associate, a key associate, James Baker, who's going to play a very strong role in dealing with the Jewish community. They call him a conference in Madrid to create a comprehensive peace settlement, and they do. Interesting, though. At one point during my career, I was asked by a Jewish organization, specifically AIPAC, to see if there were any Jews connected to Bush and to Baker. And you know what? Oh, interesting. I mean, but again, it shapes, the passionate component is removed. And he's very pragmatic in terms of American national interest. And by the way, in no way am I saying that pragmatism is a pejorative. It is definitely not, because it's the first thing we want in all our presidents. Absolutely. So he didn't have much of a relationship with the Jewish community, certainly not in Texas. The Gulf War, he got in and out, dealt with Hussein. Bill Clinton, oh, he'll come back again when we talk about Hillary. Passionate, absolutely passionate. Okay. We know he liked Jewish women, and there he was, the passionate to that extent. I'm sorry, I couldn't resist. Okay. He comes from a Baptist background. He was very tied into the Democratic Party. In Arkansas, governor of Arkansas, he was very involved with an Israel-Arkansas exchange program, similar to what we have here in Maryland, the MIDC, the Maryland Israel Development Center, and tied into AIPAC. He was a traditional Democrat, and by the way, as I say, he was personal. He had also personal relationships with lots of members of the Jewish community who were involved in financing his efforts as president. And then guess what? He lucked into something. and unfortunately one of the architects of making him a lucky man. He's being buried tomorrow in Israel, Shimon Peres, but he and Rabin had been secretly trying to negotiate, and out of that comes the Oslo Accords, and some of that lived on well in terms of out of it comes later on a Jordanian peace treaty also with Jordan, but also a settlement, a semi-settlement. Again, it has not been brought to fruition with the Palestinians, the great tragedy of the Middle East. But they created this structural settlement with the Palestinians, and he did his best to negotiate peace. And Bill Clinton is someone who, on both sides, comes away with respect, because you know that in the year 2000, he came this close to getting a settlement between Israel and the Palestinians, this close. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. One of the great missed opportunities and tragedies. Now, George Bush, number 2. Pragmatic. In terms of foreign policy, he was inexperienced. I want you to also realize that while Maryland probably has the most powerful, constitutionally most powerful governor, Texas has the least powerful governor. And that's, that was the experience that he has. And understand this coming into it. He also, by the way, he near bankrupted the Texas Rangers. He made a terrible deal in terms of Barry Bonds. He got rid of Barry Bonds, the home run leader. Anyway, so he was qualified to run for president, right? Okay. He comes in, and of course, Clinton was very involved in dealing with the Middle East. And by the way, Bush is ultimately pragmatic. He's very involved. The administration's tagline on what to do with the Middle East was very simple. ABC, anything but Clinton. And this, of course, made the Israelis happy. They didn't want American involvement. They felt very comfortable in what they wanted to do on their own. And then September 11 happens. And with September 11, Bush begins to recognize that he can't stay out of the Middle East, and that one of the countries that's going to support him to the hilt in what he wants to do is Israel. And he begins basically, I would argue that for the most part, during his 8 years, he gave Israel everything they wanted. I would argue that's a mistake. For those of you who have children, I would think most of you don't give your children everything they want. He gave them everything they wanted. Thus, he had basically no control over what Israel was going to do, and he had little control over terms of the Arab world. It was a mistake. Iraq War II happens. We all don't have to go into it. I think the candidates the other night talked enough about who supported what, etc. Mistake, yes. So this is a gentleman, very pragmatic, but he did give Israel everything he wanted. Now, in the end, I think it certainly hurt. Certainly, by hurting and not having any sway in terms of Israel, it hurt his ability to get some negotiations going, as his father was able to do between Israel and the Arab world. Okay. That gets us to President Obama. Pragmatic. He had no strong emotional or religious ties, certainly, with Israel, but he did have some, he had an affinity, now remember, in terms of growing up and his father, with Islam. So he had certainly an acquaintance with that. And he was very pragmatic. He thought like what he was, a community organizer, a lawyer. And one of his assistants, actually his chief of staff, Rahm Emanuel, an Israeli by birth, I think gave him very bad advice on how he should deal early on with the Middle East. This is the guy who's he's the mayor during the worst of the worst right now, what's going on in Chicago. He decides that he's going to go to the Middle East. He doesn't go to Israel. He does go to Egypt, addresses Egyptian youth. And, you know, what the Israelis are seeking, very simply, is they don't know this guy. They're already not trusting him, although he certainly had good credentials outside in terms of the Jewish community in Illinois. So he needs, if he's going to be able to do anything in the Middle East, he needs to make sure that both sides are there. Israel needs reassurance about him. He doesn't go to Israel, as I say. And he does something that for the Israelis is not good. On his way back to the United States, he goes to a concentration camp. And he thus implicitly identifies the creation of Israel because of what happened during the Holocaust. Now, for those of you who have been to Israel, who understand the Israeli attitudes, concerns, etc., one thing they don't want to be seen is that they are nothing more than a creation because of the Holocaust. Rightly, wrongly, that's a different debate. But he did that. And as a means of trying to get everybody together, he hit the one issue that was going to go nowhere, trying to get Israel. He gets the Israelis to stop, to put a halt to settlement building, which I would argue is a very minor issue. And he concentrates on that as the catalyst for moving ahead. And very quickly, too, he develops a strong animus with the present Israeli Prime Minister, Bibi Netanyahu. But you know something? Everybody expected when he ran for president the second time that he would do terrible with the Jewish community. And he did basically about the same. Because poll after poll, and I want to bring this up here so we understand later on, most of the Jewish community, the major issue that guides them in how they vote is not Israel. Does anybody have an idea what it is? Church-state issues. Church-state. Issues in which it seems to be the separation breaks down, and a fear constantly in terms of anti-Semitism as a result of the breakdown of church-state issues. I would argue, and this is that the biggest mistake that the Obama administration made in terms, not just in terms of foreign policy overall, but in terms of dealing with the Middle East, was the president not living up to his word. He made a commitment. He said that if the Syrians go chemical, that's the red line. He didn't do it. And since then, I think we have seen the results of that. Again, that's a topic for another lecture. But it is important to remember. And when a country like Israel, above all else, needs trust as a key ingredient, if a president on such a crucial issue makes a public statement, says he's going to do it and doesn't do it, why should the feeling of the Israelis is, why should we trust him with our security? So if you look at most recently, a week ago, the United States and Israel announced a $3.8 billion 10-year agreement to furnish aid to Israel, all military. I would argue there's a couple of messages in that for Netanyahu, and this is where it comes back to the invitation of Derma and Boehner. Before 25% of the aid could be spent in Israel, buying things from the Israeli government, Israeli defense industries, no longer, and Israel is prohibited from lobbying for more aid. I would say that's a very clear message that's there, and it may be useful for whoever becomes next president, it may not. But of course, overall, nobody, and you know, the Israeli government is certainly, the Israeli people are very hardline on Obama. I believe that's wrong. This is a man who has done his best to bring peace to the region, to be fair to both sides. And in fact, he's furnished more weaponry than any other American president. It is expected as he comes to an end of his term, and I think this is very much going to be dependent on who wins the election, he may be going to the UN and giving a timetable, asking them to support a timetable for a settlement and a withdrawal of Israel from the territories it now occupies. Okay. Now we get to Hillary and Trump. I would argue that both of them are pragmatic. Let's go with Trump first. Difficult to predict. I can't find any I can't find any religiosity anywhere. I mean, I guess he's gone to shul as many times as he's gone to church. I don't know that that's true, but he has a Jewish son-in-law, and we'll get to that. Other than the emotional ties to Israel that you may see, it's largely through his son-in-law, who is in fact an Orthodox Jew, fairly right-wing in attitude. His daughter converted to Judaism, and he has now a Jewish grandchild. And he's also going to be dealing, I'll get to this again, he has a Republican platform. That is the first platform not to support a two-state solution, a state for the Jews, Israel, and Palestine, or whatever it is to be called, for the Arab world. It opens the gates to all sorts of interesting things. Now, how much he's involved, I suspect, and people who have told me that he had little to say on that either way. At a meeting of the Republican Jewish Coalition not too long ago in the spring, he made all sorts of comments that could be, he talked about, you guys may not support me, don't like me because I know how to deal with money, and like the Jewish community, all the anti-Semitic crap. So he's made some interesting statements. He also talked about, when he did talk about Israel, he talked about Israel having to pay back aid. He talked about the United States leaving the region. But at the AIPAC speech, the main Israeli lobby, he gave a speech that, a traditional Republican Party candidate would give. But he also has, beyond those comments, he also has links to anti-Semites on the so-called alt-right. He's refused to, obviously, totally renounce Mr. Duke, David Duke. Who are going to be his advisors? Right now it's his two Jewish attorneys and his son-in-law, certainly on the Middle East. Who's going to do it on foreign policy? I have no idea. I can make a safe prediction. He's not going to receive much of the Jewish vote. Hillary, okay, long record of support for Israel perspective. She got a lot of flack for, I would argue, doing the right thing and kissing Mrs. Arafat at a meeting. Nevertheless, she was the senator of New York. She played the votes. The Democratic Party has a traditional platform supporting a two-state solution. Traditionally, Democrats will receive from the mid-60s to 80% of the Jewish vote. Because of Bill Clinton, she has significant credibility with both sides, and that is very important. Who will be her advisors? I think you're going to see the same tend to group: Ben Rhodes, Dennis Ross, Aaron Miller, Jake Sullivan. But I also would argue, and we'll get to this again in a few minutes, I think that you're going to see more of an iron fist involved. So, from FDR to Obama, what stands out? I think, first, the conflict with Israel and the Arabs, passion has been a key determinant of what the United States does. That doesn't mean it's forsaking pragmatism, because that's the major goal. The question is how much other influences hold sway. Religiosity is its most important emotional component and is a vital component in the determination of that policy. Personal relationships with individuals also hold sway. While many presidents consider clearly that everything they do, they will interpret in terms of national security, other variables, I think we've seen, play significant roles. And even beyond passion, as I say, domestic politics, bureaucratic politics, that's the influence of the State Department, the national security agencies, the intelligence agencies, et cetera. Those administrations where policy is seen very indicative of a strong, passionate component have tended, I would argue, to adopt positions where the pro-Israel community is relatively happy. More often than not, pragmatism results in pragmatic administration, what some would call even-handed policy. And in the Jewish world, that is often interpreted as pro-Arab. I would argue again, it certainly is not. I think even-handed policy, we're talking about even-handed policies for the United States of America. And when you have a domestic policy component, and of course you do in so many states, especially in presidential elections with the Electoral College, domestic politics is often seen very much coexisting with the passionate component. And conversely, domestic politics tends to have much less of a sway during more pragmatic administrations. Bush would be the best example of that. Okay, let's do some predicting. Hillary is almost passionately pragmatic. She gets the passion from her husband, again in a totally secular sense here, but she's very keyed into, as Secretary of State, international security issues and foreign policy. She will be, I believe, more hardline than Obama in both directions. And she will take the party platform and move it in directions, she'll ignore it where she thinks is fit to do so, and otherwise she will clearly uphold it and make it stronger. I think that any settlement that will come out of this in terms of Hillary will be much tending to be on a more even-handed end. But I also believe that one of the things she's going to do very early on, because of the trust of that individual in both the Arab world as well as in Israel, is appoint Bill Clinton as her Middle East negotiator. I think you're going to see it early on to see if she can get somewhere. Remember, he came close in the year 2000 to a full settlement. Now, Trump, I'll use the word, the great unknown. The party platform is one that no one in the Middle East should be happy about, because my own belief is, without a two-state solution, both sides are going to lose terribly. But, by the way, there is a line in there that says, affirms the U.S. desire for comprehensive peace to be negotiated among those living in the region. Okay. In an era of revolution of rising expectation, the Arab Spring, etc., to not negotiate a settlement that is acceptable, and I'll just use that word, in the Arab world, is going to be a tragic, major mistake. And we shall see how that plays out. But in the end, for those who view the positions of the candidates as a key factor on how they will vote, I would suggest that all of you shift your ground to support the candidate you feel would be most able to keep America relatively safe and secure. Only a strong America will provide Israel, the Palestinians, the Arab world, and most of the world with the security conditions that are necessary for their mutual security and survival. Based on this posture alone and all else, I would say the answer is relatively easy on who best would keep America secure. And now I'm going to enjoy something because I can be partisan. And I'll, it's very easy for me to say what I'm going to say. Never Trump. Passion, or the lack of it, needs to be understood as one of the factors that will influence policy. With Trump, as all else, there's just not enough there. There's not enough knowledge. Forgetting a bit, say passion was completely missing from the equation. I would want him, as I would want any presidential candidate, to be able to decide what to do in the Middle East, as I would want them to do on any foreign policy issues, to do it in what they believe is best in terms of American security. And that means an understanding of the military, American history, American foreign policy, other nations, NATO, CETA, you name it. I believe very strongly that with Trump, we will see hair-trigger responses, and in the Middle East, that is not good. In fact, it is suicidally dangerous. Thank you, and I'm ready for questions. Okay. The question was, why didn't I say anything about Iran? Did I yeah. It's an interesting discussion. Is the Iran, this is me talking now, is the Iran agreement flawed? Yes. Is it absolutely necessary, and in the end, do I support it a year after it was adopted? Yes. Iran is a major danger, and given that major danger and given the nuclear component to it, to think that Donald Trump would have anything to do with it scares the hell out of me. The question was, what pressures what ability to influence the Israelis they will have, since they already worked out a 10-year arms deal. Look, when you want to, those involved in diplomacy know you can always find and adopt and use pressure points when you want to use them. I do not, by the way, I think Hillary knows all too well, both serving Secretary of State and otherwise, settlements is not an important issue. It's an important issue in one segment of the Israeli electorate that keeps Bibi in power. Okay? That's really what it's about. They've worked out an agreement in terms of dealing with that and how to deal with it and what would be evacuated and what not. It was all negotiated in 2000, and in 2007 it was again discussed under Olmert's prime ministership. Actually, it was discussed in Annapolis. The settlement is there. What it's going to take is the ability to put the pressures on both sides. Israel can be pressured, but of course, you've got a prime minister and a president who are problems. I think that Bill Clinton, I feel very strongly that Bill Clinton's going to be able to work something out. But he won't be under a deadline. That's why I hope within the first year appointed. Remember, what ended the negotiations was the fact that the administration had come to an end. They tried to revive something, it didn't work. There are individuals who are able to do certain things.
This has been, I think, quite an extraordinary evening. Very seldom do you have a chance to be with someone who's as deeply informed as is our friend Art Abramson. And it's a shame we just don't have more time. But deeply in your debt. This was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.